So in the last tutorial, we got XY motion working with our character. To start with in this one, I said I was going to talk about how to use, how to basically have a joystick attached. Now, I work in OS X, and that provides some additional hurdles to using gamepads, as sometimes the drivers aren't there and it doesn't work quite right. If you have a Windows machine and like an Xbox, then you should just be able to plug the controller in and use it right away. The Logitech controller I was talking about in the last time, I think it's the F310 or something like that, seems to work with OS X pretty well. There's some drivers that I installed, and it just seems to work. It's a little trickier getting it to work once we build the project, but at least in the editor it works pretty well. So the way that you work with controllers like gamepads in Unity is you go up to edit and go down to project settings and click on your input manager, right? And you have your axes are totally hidden. You open that up, and the first set, which I'm just going to shrink up because I opened these up for a reason, but let's just go ahead and go. Right, the first set of horizontal, vertical options here are the keys, right? It's the A, the D, left, right arrows, and the same goes with the vertical. It's going to be, right, the up and down keys, the S and W keys. And so those are our first two copies that have this name. If we go further down to the second horizontal and vertical, and I flip that open, you'll see that there's this joystick axis. Now, by default, these are, instead of this third axis, joysticks and scroll wheels, it usually says X-axis here, and then vertical says Y-axis. And in each controller is going to be different. Each gamepad's going to be a little different. But in my case, the X and Y axis was the direction pad, right? On the left side of the controller, the leftmost control is that 4 direction pad. Those were the defaults. But I wanted to use one of the thumbsticks to control this motion. And so I just had to sort of go through and set this and test it. But in my case, the left thumbstick is the third axis, and then I go down and it's the fourth axis. All right, and then the fifth and sixth axis is probably the next thumb pad, but maybe not. There's also buttons, and then the left and right trigger buttons that you use your pointer finger to manipulate. I believe those may be listed as axes as well, because I think they have, at least I'm not sure if they're just on-off in my case, or if they have a sliding scale from 0 to 1, right? And so that's something that every controller is going to be a little different. Some are just buttons, and some actually allow you to gently squeeze or pull, in order to adjust, how much pressure you're putting on there. The springiness of these makes me feel like the lower ones have a bit more freedom and the top ones are just buttons. But I don't know. I haven't gone that far. I haven't needed to use them for a project yet. So I just wanted to let you know that's how you do it, and you just have to kind of go through. There are apps that you can download for free or for a small cost that will actually show you which axes are being used when you use different buttons and things. And so that's another option to see, to figure out what is what. And sometimes they tell you, but I couldn't find in Logitech anywhere, how they mapped all these different things. So that's how you can quickly interface that. Again, you might need to do some legwork on the back end to install drivers or figure out how to get it to work. But most things work pretty well. Okay, so let's go ahead and do these tiles. So one of the first things we're going to need to do is we're going to need, it's going to be really hard to see what's happening if we're just using a boring gray tile. And so I went into Illustrator quickly and I created an asset that you should download if you've got if you've got it. I don't have this online anywhere, but I made this road tile, and I just went in and created something. You could use any image you want. Just download anything and that you can use as a texture, and then we'll apply it to a material. So in this case, I've already applied it to this road material. If you want to go through these steps, right, you right click, you go import new asset, and then you find wherever you downloaded the image file that you want to use. You import that. It should come in as a default texture type and a 2D texture shape. Everything else, you just leave everything totally alone. And then you just need to create a new material. Click on this little dot. And, I've got a lot of options in here. So you could also, whatever this file name is, you can just search for that up here and then select it. And that will be the color. And then you just apply the material to your plane. Now you'll note that in my case, I made a mistake when I created this. You'll see there's a white outline, right? Like I should have actually had the road, the different shapes that I created in Illustrator extend beyond the edges because I missed a pixel all the way around. But that actually, for seeing where the seam is between the two different tiles, it's actually a really useful mistake to have made. It'll make this next section much more clear. Okay, so I've got something on here so I can see, and we're basically recreating Pole Position, which was a game on the Atari 2600 that was like one of the original racing games, and I played that for hours and hours and hours, and it basically looked like this. There was like a couple objects in here that would other cars that you would pass, and you basically just went fast, and there were areas that went slow. So I've got this set, and now what I need to do is I need to be able to, I'm going to turn this into a prefab in a little bit, but I want to set some things up with this before I do that. So let's go ahead and select our plane in our hierarchy, and let's rename it road tile. And that might be problematic for me because I have other road tiles, so I'm just going to call this road tile 1 in my case. You should all just call it road tile. And now that I've made this road tile, what I need to do is I need to add a couple things to this. So first, this does already have a mesh collider on it, which we want. But what we really need is we need a way for this to move. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say add component. And we are going to add a graph. And we're going to go ahead and have this be a macro because we can't use embeds with prefabs. However, we could, there's a way to get around that if needed. But at this point, so I'm just going to call this tile graph. And all we're going to do with this is we're going to use this graph I'm going to click edit. We're going to use this graph to move these tiles through the scene, right? And so let's go ahead and get started. So first we want to make sure our tiles, at whatever position it's at. My mouse just decided to freak out for a second for some reason. Okay, I'm going to right click, I'm going to say add unit, and what we need to do is, we need to move this. And we're not going to be moving this with we don't need the character controller, we don't need any of that. We're just going to be moving this unit through. Now, in order to do that, we are going to need, in order to move this and have it make collisions with things, we need a rigid body on here. So this is something that, again, I had forgotten, and I was working with this, and the road was just like not colliding with the collider that we're going to use to basically disappear it and move it back to the front of the line. And I was just banging my head against the wall. And so in order for triggers to work, And for this thing to function, it needs a rigid body to be attached to it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this, and I'm going to go to Physics. I'm going to go to Rigid Body, which happens to be right where my mouse landed. And I'm going to add a rigid body. Now, when I do this, what I need to do first is say, I'm going to uncheck Use Gravity, and I'm going to check mark Is Kinematic. Now, what that does is use gravity, right? This means that it's not going to just drop into infinity as soon as we hit play if we uncheck Use Gravity. But if we just uncheck Use Gravity and don't check mark Is Kinematic, then anything that bumps into this is going to push it around in 3D space, right? So it'll essentially be floating weightless. And if we run into it with one of our objects, it's going to get moved all over the scene. But Is Kinematic basically says we're going to be giving it instructions for how to move, so don't allow the physics engine to move it. Okay, so we've got our rigid body on there. We've got it set up the right way. We're going to go ahead and right click, and now we are going to say that what we want to do is every frame we want to be able to move this unit a little bit. And so we're going to need the rate at which we want to move it. We're also going to need to have the to store the position and to update the position. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to right click, and I'm going to need to get my current position. So I'm just going to say transform dot position and get. I'm definitely going to need a transform position dot set as well. So why don't we go ahead and get that? Right, because this is the thing that I want to do, right? This is the very last step that I want to take. Now the question is, what do I want to do, right? So let's say that I have this thing. Now I want it to be moving this direction, right? Because we want it to seem as though the character is moving forward in the Z direction. So we actually want to have a negative speed, right? It needs to be going in the negative Z direction as it moves. So let's go ahead and do this. And we're going to create this as a object variable. And we're just going to call this tile speed. And we'll make it a float. And so to start with, we're going to set the speed to -10. And then once I've created that variable, I'm just going to try like 8 times to click and drag it into my graph. And for some reason, it is not going to go. And if that doesn't work, I can always just say get var and then just get, oops, not graph. I can switch this to object, and then I should be able to just come in here and say tile speed. Right? I have no idea why the click and drag is so flaky, at least for me. Okay, so I know I need this tile speed. Now, when we moved things previously, we've also had, right, we've done the multiplication and the time delta time, right? So these are some things that we probably need to do again. So let's go ahead and say add unit, and we'll just say time.de should get us where we want. There we go. And we'll want to multiply these two things together. This is like it's like almost every time you do this, this is something that we do. So, so then we'll want to multiply, and we could either use, because we're using two objects that we're going to be filling in both things, we can just use math generic, and we can just plug this into A and plug this into B. Now, what we need to do is, this is the amount that we want to move, right? What we're getting out here is the number of units that we need to move in this frame, right? And so what we need to do is we need to be adding that to wherever we last were, right? So when this frame starts, what was our position? This is the number of units we want to add to that position. Then we add those in there, and then we apply that to whichever axis we're interested in applying it to. So in this case, which would be Z. So let's go ahead and do that next step. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to say add unit, and the unit I'm going to add is not, oh, look at that, add. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click the generic. I'm going to bring this up into the B. I'm going to pull, oh, I can't pull this straight into the A, but what I can do is if I click here and I just click again somewhere out here, and then you'll see that right now it's not giving me anything, but if I just type in Z, or if I just type in get, then what it will do is it automatically gets pretty close to vector3.z get Z. That's the one I want. And then I can run this in here. And then I can create the one final unit I need, right? Because what this is, right, I can't take this float and put it into a vector3, so I need to do the new vector3, XYZ, and then maybe give myself a little bit more space, connect this into the Z, and then connect this through here. And now that I've done all of that, what I need to do is I need to connect the flow, right? Everything's grayed out because I don't have my flow connected, so I'm going to say update. I'm just going to snake this over here and snake this over here. And let's see if this works. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And I'm actually going to zoom out a bit so I can see it going a little bit further. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. Okay, and notice that it's a little bit jittery when it goes. All right, so one of the things I might want to do, there is a collision happening here that may be slowing it down a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and select Bob, or my player, if that's what you named it again. And because I set this radius to 0.6, I'm actually going to go ahead and set this to 0.6. And I might even set it, because then there isn't that jamming up that could potentially be happening. That's one thing. The other thing that might help is right now I'm just using the standard update function, which can vary in when it happens, right? It can be a few milliseconds late or a few milliseconds early, which can actually lead to a stuttering effect. Whereas if I use a different type of update called fixed update, then what that does is it works with it makes sure that things happen at exactly the same time every frame. And so if I'm just going to go ahead and actually select my update event and click replace. And I'm just going to type fixed. And fixed update is the third option. And so, right, it says fixed update is called every fixed frame rate frame. So even if other things are taking longer to execute or whatever, this is always going to fire at exactly the same time. So with those two things in place, it should be a little bit smoother now. Now, I might have some stutter when I start up just because things are slow, but you can see as it goes, it's getting a little bit better. And we'll see that once this has run a little longer and we're starting to cycle this thing over, we will have much better results. Okay, so the other thing that I need to do is I need to figure out how many tiles I'm going to need in order to be able to see, in order to not be able to see the tile generate up here or the tile disappear back here. Now, one of the things we can do, if I pull this really quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this road tile, and I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm just going to pull this thing back, right? This is about 10 units back. I'm not too concerned about these being perfect. It's really just to see how many I need. So in this case, right, with where I have my camera set currently, right, I only really need one tile on the other side of the player. But let's see how many tiles I need in front, right? It looks like I could probably get away with one of these, but it really depends on how high I want this my camera to be. If I go to my main camera, right, and right now it's set with Y to 1. If I was to say set Y to 5, which is probably higher than I want it to be, and then rotate my X, right, rotate around the X-axis, right, that's way, if I have it up this high, I'm going to need significantly more tiles to go off into the horizon, to make it to the horizon line, right? And so what I want to do is make it so that it's easy to see things somewhere in the happy middle, right, where it's easy to see things coming, but it's not, but I don't have to draw quite so many tiles. So if I say 2.5, that gives me a little bit better view. And then I can, you know, just adjust the rotation here and make it so I can't see anything or whatever, right? But I can give myself a little bit better view. And we'll see if, you know, how this works out as we go forward. So let's see how many tiles I need in this direction. So I've set, so I've got one here, and if I keep going out, you'll notice that these grids, the grid is spaced at 10 units. So if I come forward here, right, that's, so there's, let's see here. So I've got 1 there, 2 there, 3 there, 4 there. If I did 5 up front, I can adjust my angle a little bit and I would be good. So that means I would need a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. And now I'm going to go ahead and check. Oops. All right, so if I come back here, yeah, it looks like even at this angle, 1 tile behind is still good. So 7 tiles total is what I'm going to need. Now, I've got these things all set. I'm going to go ahead and delete this tile because I don't need it right now. So we've got all of these settings set. Now, one of the things to note is we're going to turn this into a prefab, right, by dragging it down into our assets. And when we do this, you want to, the easiest way to work is to get all of your, to get everything set up on the one prefab the way that you want it to be, and then add those, and then add prefabs into the scene rather than working with one prefab and making any major changes, right? If you're doing any more changes than transforms and things like that, like if you're adding new components, if you're, you know, setting other variables and things like that, like if we set the tile speed variable here, that could be problematic, and it may make sense eventually to actually have this tile speed to create a game manager object that sets the tile speed variable, or to create a variable that's a scene level variable, so that we can make this adjustment somewhere else. But for the time being, we are going to leave it the way it is. But just to note, make all the major changes you want to make before you start creating copies of these things. Okay, so let's go ahead and there's one last thing we need to test before we start creating new copies of this. So this tile is at 0, right? This would be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and maybe 60 is where we want that last tile to be. I think that's about where it was. And then, negative 10 here, right? And so what we want to do is we don't want to destroy these tiles. We want to be able to essentially recycle them. So what we're going to do is they're going to come sailing down this way. We're going to set up a collider here so that when they hit that collider, it's going to be set up as a trigger. They will be instantaneously transported to this position and continue sliding this way. That way, it's sort of like an endless track, right? Like almost like a treadmill for our player to ride along, right? And this is how to make a really simple version of like a racing game. All right, so let's go ahead and save this real quick. And so when we start doing these things, it would be really good to have a parent object to hold all of this stuff in terms of organization. So I'm going to go ahead and create an empty object, and I'm going to change the name in the inspector, because that's the fastest way for me, to, I'm just going to call it road tile, road tiles. Sure, we'll just call it road tiles. And then for now, I'm going to go ahead and drop road tile 1 in there. And then I'm going to create another object that is, again, an empty object. So I'm just going to say, and I'm going to say create empty child, because I want it to be, I have the road tile selected. I want it to be a child of the road tiles. And I am going to call this tile trigger. And this tile trigger object currently has no value whatsoever and nothing to it. But what we need to add is a box collider. So I'm just going to type in box and select box collider. I'm going to check mark is trigger. And then right now it's pretty tiny. I want it to be as wide as this road tile is. So if I expand this in the X direction, it looks like if I go to 10, that should be about right. And then in the Y direction, I'm going to go ahead and make this 10 as well. I want to make sure that anything I generate, because we're going to be using this actually as the trigger that causes a lot of different things to happen. But I want to make sure that nothing slips past. And then the last thing I want to do is for the position of this object, this tile trigger object, I need to go in negative in the Z direction. And we're going to try a couple things. So first I'm going to go back to, let's try negative 25, right? That puts us right at this grid point here. Okay. So now this trigger is set up. Now the question is, what do we want to have the code on the individual tiles to set the trigger, or do we want to have the code on the trigger itself? And in general, because we know we're going to have obstacles that are coming by here that we want to either disappear or repeat up here. We might have power-ups. We might have all sorts of other things that are hitting this collider. And so it would be easier to have all of those options happening in this one place, right? If it hits if any of these different tagged objects hit this, we can kind of sort through and figure out what's going on. There's no reason why you couldn't have each of the different types of objects have their own graph as well that tells them what to do when they hit this trigger. And we'll look at, we'll kind of look at both examples. So let's go ahead and add a component. So surprisingly enough, we're going to be adding, if I just type in flow, we're going to be adding a flow machine. And so again, we could do this as an embed, which might be a better option, we'll see. But we're going to start by making a macro. And I'm going to call this road tile trigger. And I've been putting this in my assets folder, which is probably a bad idea. I should be putting it in my scripts folder and hit save. Okay, so I don't need start or update at all. I'm just actually going to right click or select both of those, right click and delete them. What I need is, we've turned this into a trigger, so I need on trigger enter. So I'm going to say on trigger. And I'm going to click on trigger enter, and self is what we want. And we've done all of this before, so you could always go back and copy some of what you've done and then make modifications for this set. But if you remember, we need a trigger, and when we have this collision happen, we need to know what object it is or what type of object is colliding with this. And the way we do that is through tags. And so if I select, let's say my road tile, right now it's untagged. Now I've created a whole bunch of tags in here. And so you probably don't have all of these tags here, but you could go add tag, and you could say plus, and I'm going to be using roadway. That's just what I called it. You could, call it road tile or whatever, or roadway, whatever works. Roadway is a little shorter to type. Make sure you note whether or not you've capitalized it and how you've spelled it. But I'm just going to go ahead and use roadway. So I'm going to select my road tile again. I'm going to tag this as roadway. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to my tile trigger. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click. I'm going to say add unit. And I'm going to say, right, if you remember, we need to compare the tag to something. So I'm going to type in compare tag. And it's going to say game object compare tag. Now, this may just allow us to run this collider straight in here, and it might work. I can't remember, so we'll figure that out in a second. But let's go ahead, and so I've got that flow going, and now I just need the tag. And I could either just type it in here, but remember, we're going to probably have different objects in here, and I may want to reuse this later. So let's go ahead and we'll use this as a graph variable. And I'm going to just call this tile as the variable and name, and I'm going to make this a string. And again, and the string I'm going to put in there is whatever my tag is. So it's roadway. And then once I've done that, I can either struggle with clicking and dragging to create this or whatever, but I'm going to drop this in here. Now, once that happens, I need to then figure out what I want to do in this case. And so what I want to do is I want to take whatever the current Z position is, and I want to jump this all the way to 60 units in the Z direction, right? So this is going to hit this thing when it's probably at when this is at -20, because that front edge is at, we'll hit it at a few units earlier. And so what I want to do is I want to jump that forward. So first I need to be able to do that when this is true. So if I go here and I go to my control options, branch is what I want as the option. And right, all this does is it takes this flow, and if it's true, it sends it out here. And if a roadway is what hits this collider, then it's going to do what it's going to send flow out the true. And if it's something else, it's going to send flow out the false. This is a way that I can then go in and do another compare here if it's false to see if it's another type of game object, right? So if it's true, what I want to do is I want to update the position of my transform for whatever object this is that I've collided with. So if I click add unit and I go ahead and say transform dot position and set, all right? So if this is true, I want to set this position, and I know that I want to leave X and Y alone, and I want to set this to 60. And then under self, instead of self, what I would like to do is use the game object from this collider. Now, this may cause problems, we will see, but we're going to find out really quick if this works or not. So let's go ahead and hit run. And if it doesn't work, then there's another unit we're going to need to use to fix that. Okay, so it blew right through there. Why did it blow right through there? Let's select our road tile. We have the tag roadway. We have our tile trigger waiting for trigger events. And let's go ahead and see if we actually even get a collision. Okay, so we didn't even see a collision. So why is that? What are we missing on our objects? So we've got our rigid body here on this object. If I look at my tile trigger, there is no rigid body here. And the other potential issue with this is that this mesh collider may need to be convex. We're going to figure that out really quick. So let's go ahead and test that. Now what convex does is it actually creates a collider around here, but that shouldn't be an issue because in the previous example when I worked on it, that didn't work. And you'll notice that when I create that convex collider, I get a lot more volume here and it's going to be colliding with my player. So I don't want that. That shouldn't be the issue. Let's go ahead and select our tile trigger. Let's try adding a rigid body tag to this. So I just typed RI, rigid body. And again, right, we don't want this to use gravity, and we want to set it to is kinematic, which will just basically lock it in place. So let's see if that fixes the problem. And if not, then maybe we've got some other issues going on. Okay, I'm going to stop this. Okay, so that wasn't working. And from this view, it looks like it should be colliding. But if I click and drag, you'll notice that it's actually not colliding in any way, shape, or form, right? This thing is completely offset. So let's go select our tile trigger. Now it says that it's at Z in the, right, it says its position is correct, but for some reason, this thing is not right in any way, shape, or form. And so you'll note that when I created this road tiles object, it dropped it at any old place that was not right. So if I go ahead in here, let's go ahead and reset this, and you'll notice that a lot of other changes happen. And that's because the child objects are relative to are in position relative to the position of the road tile. So, right, this is now currently at this setting, which is not what we want at all. So let's go ahead and reset this. And note that if we reset all of this, it will reset scale. So in this case, it doesn't matter because I haven't scaled anything, but it would have reset this if this was a longer tile or something. Now with the tile trigger, if I right click on this, right, I want this to stay at -25, which is where it is, and it should still be in 0, 0. So now if I use my thing, I can say, okay, that's definitely going to hit this collider. So let's go ahead and see if this works. Oh, and look at that. It works. Now, one thing we should probably do is we're going to let it go through one more time. And then the other thing that we should do is see if we need the rigid body on the tile trigger or not. Right? That was one of our tests. And if we delete this, if we remove this component temporarily, and then add it and then run this again, we can see if that will still work without it having the rigid body attached. If so, that's great because that's one less call to the physics engine. Oh, look, and it works great. So that's one less call to the physics engine, which just makes our game a little bit more efficient and kind of optimizes it, right? You only want rigid bodies on objects that need rigid bodies on them, right? And in this case, having a rigid body on this tile is important to get it to work. Okay, so fantastic. We've got our one tile working. Let's go ahead and stop this. And this is a great time to save our scene. And now what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into a prefab, and then we are going to make we're going to make 7 copies of it. And we're going to set each one of those copies to have a different starting Z value, right? So that they line up in a road. So to do that, I'm going to go to my project pane. I've got a prefabs folder somewhere. You could also just drag it into the main one. This is getting really ugly and I should probably clean it up, and I apologize for making you all look at my lack of organization, but I'm going to go to prefabs. I'm just going to grab road tile 1, drag it and drop it in there. You'll see it gives me a little preview of what this thing is. All my variables are available. I can adjust them here. And so let's go ahead and get this set. So I've got the road tile 1. Something I might want to test is if I can adjust this value somewhere else. And so let's go ahead and set that up before we go any further. To do that, I'm going to open the prefab so that I know that I'm not making what they call overrides on the original object, which basically means like I have all these prefabs, they're all the same, but I've made a few adjustments to these, like say the position. And if I want to, and those are called overrides, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. Let's open the prefab, select road tile 1, let's go to our flow graph. And what I'd like to do is to create a scene level variable that's going to just be called, we'll call it road speed. And we are going to make that a float. We'll set that to -10 for the time being. And then what we're going to do is when this starts, right, what we want to do is we want to set our tile speed variable based on this road speed variable. This means that we can set this, and that might be something that we put in our update chain of events as well. So, on the fly, we could adjust that speed, right? Because that's something we kind of want to be checking all the time. So let's go ahead but to start, we're going to right click, we're going to say add unit, and we're going to say get variable, get var, and we're going to say get scene variable. And then down here we can, we should be able to create, let's go ahead and just click and drag this down here. I have no idea why that did not work. And maybe there's something wrong with what I'm doing here, and we'll figure it out in a second. But then we also need to set a variable, right? So we need to right click and say set var will get us there. And this should be a set object variable, and we should be able to find tile speed. There it is. And so we're going to put whatever road speed is into tile speed, and then shoot this over. And apparently I put that in the wrong connection. Let's undo that. There we go. So we want flow over here, and I actually want this to go down to this green dot. I just spazzed, right? So when this starts, we want to make sure we have the correct speed. And then the other thing we need to do is we will need this get road speed variable. Now, we potentially could just replace this tile speed with road speed and get it across, but we're going to do it this extra convoluted way. So let's go ahead and right click. Oh, and something else that happened is this is no longer a fixed update for some reason. I have no idea why that is. So let's go ahead and replace this with fixed update. Maybe we did this while it was open. I don't know. But let's go to fixed update, fix that. So then we can come down here and, we've set that variable, but let's go ahead and just select these two objects and hit copy and paste. And then with these two, we need a flow here. Now, something we could do is we could either do this at the start of the frame or at the end of the frame. And it's probably wise just to do it at the start of the frame. So I'm going to come down here. And then once that happens, I'm going to run this back over here. All right, so, so we can set the tile speed, and then a little bit later, it's going to get that speed and that we've just set and send it through. So let's see if all of this works as it stands, and if nothing is broken. Okay, it is still working exactly as it should, which is a great sign. Okay, so let's go ahead and pause this. And let's hop back here. Let's save this again. And now that I've jumped back out of my prefab, I just want to run it one more time and make sure everything is happening. Because notice that the that my flow graph wasn't actually doing anything earlier. So I just want to make sure this is actually working as a prefab. Fantastic. Now I can stop this. And so now it's time to create our different road tiles. And so this one's at 0. And so what I may do is figure out an order to put these in. So I'm just going to say Command C or Control C and Control V to paste. Now, what I probably want to do is put this tile trigger up above. It doesn't really, the order doesn't necessarily matter. But with this one, and this really just depends on how I want to do this, I'm going to go ahead and have this one be the one that goes to -10. So I'm going to, right, so this one's at 0. This one, I'm going to say, select this, and I'm going to hit -10, right? So that hops back there. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste tile 1 again. Now, what it does is it drops these all underneath, and what I'd like is to have these in order in the hierarchy in a way that makes sense in the scene as well. So this one I'm going to set to 10 in the Z. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this. It's going to drop it down to the bottom again. I'm going to pull it back up. This one we can do 20. And then I can copy this one and paste it and pull it up here and set this to 30. Now, what we're doing, and again, we'll just do this until we get to 60. So I'm going to hit copy, paste, pull this back up. And maybe we actually go to 50 instead of 60. You know, it doesn't, I'm getting tired of doing all this copying and pasting and moving of objects. But so I'm going to go ahead and put number 6 at 50. And if that's the case, right, if we just go to 50, which I'm pretty happy with going to 50, then what I need to do is I need to go to my tile trigger, and I need to open my graph, edit my graph if I haven't, and just adjust this value here that's 60 to 50. Now, we could create a variable that would house these values, so we could adjust this on the fly, but it's something that once it's set, we don't really need to change it, at least with this. Now, that may change if you wanted to make this more advanced so that turns, right? So if you had a curved tile, so you could start making corners happen. And this would be really great, right? If you're making like a big racer and you want a set map, there are ways to basically not draw parts of the scene when they're not on screen and not have those objects just sort of hanging out. But you really want to have like a model of an entire map, right? If you wanted this to be some sort of endless, randomly generated road to nowhere, this is the way to do it. Okay, but it also teaches us a lot about setting things up to appear and disappear. All right, so if I go ahead and hit play, at this point, we'll see if this all works out the way it's supposed to. So we've got tiles hopping forward, hopping backward. If everything is correct, we should see no weird overlaps in any of these tiles. If you have you'll notice that even though these are on even numbers, right? They start at 10 or 0, 10, 20, you know, etc. I have this set at 25, -25, right? And that's because if I set it at -30 or -20, when it respawns these things, they actually respawn over each other a little bit and it gets all messed up. But so now we have a road going, and you can see it looks pretty crappy up there, but that's fine. And I can move my character side to side, but I fly way off the edges of the road, and I can go for infinity. And I can go up and down for infinity as well. All right, so you can see how this is working. So now we need some boundaries for our motion, and we need to start generating some obstacles as well. So before we do the next tutorial, let's create some boundaries, because that's pretty easy. And then we can, and then in the next tutorial, we will actually create some obstacles. Okay. So I've stopped it, and so now we need to create our boundaries. And so I'm going to select the road tiles object because I want these boundaries to be children of the road tiles. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did to create the tile trigger. I'm going to go up to plus, create empty child, and I'm going to say add component, and I don't need a rigid body. What I need is a box collider, so I'm going to say box collider. And then I'm going to rename this to left boundary. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust the scale, or I guess the size of my box collider. I don't need to adjust the scale of my object here. I do want to make sure that's all zeroed out to start with. And so what I need is in the Z direction, I want this to be, let's just say 10 units long. It could be longer, it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to say 10. And then in the Y, I also want this to be 10. And now here's where I might want to, I could adjust the center of this. I could do all of this in the box collider if I wanted to. I could also just set Y to 5 here. Oops. Oh, that's the scale, sorry. The position to 5. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. Now, something to note, if I have this set to 5 and my collider is just off the edge here, there might be a little gap, and there's a small chance that I could slip through there on accident. So what I may want to do is just say 4.9, right? So it sets in a little bit, which is hard to see from where I'm at, but if you rotate the view here, you can kind of see it sets down in a little bit. And then what I want to do is I just want to move this boundary over so it's, you know, right about at the edge of that. Now, you can see that's a negative. What we want is probably -5 in the X position. And you'll see that's not actually accurate. I want it to be, I don't think, hold on, it's really hard to see because these lines show through everything. So let's go ahead and look in our scene view. And, you know, if we don't want to be able to run to the edge of the grass, this would be a good spot. We could also push this back. Maybe let's just do -5.5. Okay, so now there's like a little bit of overlap, but we're basically on the side there. And then what we need to do is I'm going to pull this up as well near the tile trigger, and I might just go up above that. And I'm going to say left boundary. I'm just going to copy it and paste it. And I'm going to rename this to right boundary instead. And again, pull it back up here. And then all I need to do is make this 5.5, and it will be on the other side. Now, the other boundary that we probably need, just because we can sort of freely go up and down, eventually we'd probably want to maybe have jumping or have some sort of ramps or something. So instead of the character just being able to go vertically in the air, but we might want to have a top boundary as well. And so to do that, we could copy and paste one of these to the top. I'm not going to do that right now, but if you are interested in doing that, you can. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Now, hopefully our tiles don't collide with the side boundaries, but hopefully our character does, right? So now the character hits the sides and stops. All right, so we have a very limited amount of space in which we can move, right? We still can go up into infinity if we want to, but we have these boundaries stopping us from being able to go too much further off the edge of the road. Okay, so in the next tutorial, we are going to add some obstacles.